Let's bring in Hollywood divorce attorney David Glass for more on this. David?
People going through divorces are going through some of the hardest times of their lives, and a lot of what they're going through is emotional. And in any divorce, there's a huge sense of loss, and loss of relationship, of money, some friends.
Hi, I'm David Glass for the Hourglass Podcast. If you've been tracking our first 4 episodes in Season 8, you know we've been covering 2 pretty serious subjects: parental alienation and domestic violence. Now, in our last episode, I interviewed Matt Murphy, a former prosecutor who's tried many high-profile cases that involved intimate partner murder. This episode, we're going to start looking at the role of the perpetrator, not the victim. Today, we're talking to one of the country's most prominent criminal defense attorneys, Mark Geragos. He's best known for his work on many high-profile cases, including the resentencing of the Menendez brothers and the Scott Peterson trial. He has also represented many celebrities over the years, including singer Chris Brown, former heavyweight champ Mike Tyson, NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, former President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and in July of 25, Mark was the architect of the Sean Diddy Combs acquittal for some of the charges against the rap mogul. Today, we're going to talk to Mark about the consequences for those who commit domestic violence in any form, whether it's parental alienation or credible threats, whether they're inferred, implied, or real. Also, we're going to talk about the punishment for those who assault an ex-intimate partner. Mark will also educate us as to what constitutes domestic violence and how the law, including some of today's new legislation, could land a person in jail. Mark Geragos, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you on the Hourglass Podcast.
I'm happy to be here. I apologize profusely as we've stutter-stepped a couple of times. So
that's life as an active litigator. You're constantly shifting around your calendar.
Well, I always figure there's a reason I'm in a firehouse. I always feel like I'm putting out fires.
Right. That's your main job. Let me going back. When did you decide to become a lawyer, and how did that roll out for you?
Well, I was programmed. My father was my lawyer. The firm is called Geragos and Geragos, and it's because I joined him. And I used to say that during the summers, I'd follow him around to court, and I saw this so-called job where you went into court, you got to eat bagels in the morning, you go into court and talk, shoot your mouth off, get a 2-hour lunch, and you'd be done by 4:30. I said, geez, being a prosecutor is the easiest job I've ever seen.
Right. And so he was a prosecutor, and then by the time you got out of law school, he had started the firm and switched over to defense?
Yeah, so I tell this story. For those who have never heard it, I'll repeat it. When I was about 13, I followed him to court right close to where I live right now, Glendale Courthouse. And he was a hard-charging homicide prosecutor as I was growing up. So I was watching him prosecute this kid. And I say kid because he looked like he was my age, but he must have been just barely 18, for being in a room where marijuana was smoked. And back then, that was incomprehensible to me. I did not understand how being in a room, a status basically, could get you convicted. And he convinced the judge to give this kid state prison. And I had this heartfelt talk with him afterwards as we drove home. How could you do that? How do you sleep at night? Blah, 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 blah. Shortly thereafter, he left the DA's office. And by the time I went to college and law school, I joined him. When I eulogized him 10 years ago, I told that story. And my mother came up to me afterwards and said, it's so cute that you think that's why he left the office. And I said, well, that is why. And she said, no, you were the oldest of 3 boys. You were about to enter high school. And if you thought I was going to put the 3 through college on 17 grand a year, you're crazy. So just goes to show you.
That's a great story. I mean, my dad's a retired doctor, and I worked at his hospital one summer thinking I was going to become a doctor. And he worked. He was an anesthesiologist. He had me as a schlepper. They would bring people in and out of the operating room. They'd yell schleppers, and I'd bring in the next person. And I just couldn't take the sight of blood, or they were drilling and cutting and all that stuff. And then my dad told me the joke. What do you call a nice Jewish boy who can't stand the sight of blood? You call him
a lawyer.
And so I went that way.
So both of my kids, I would take around with me. My daughter has become kind of a top tier New York criminal defense lawyer. In fact, successfully represented Diddy and Pharma Bro and various others. My son, on the other hand, got sight of this and said, I want to get as far away as possible, and is now a Michelin star chef. So it
Wow.
just shows to show you that sometimes they follow what you want and sometimes they don't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's get into our subject matter.
Sure.
If you could, for our audience, could you define what domestic violence is? If someone's going for a domestic violence restraining order, what's the basic definition?
So, in most jurisdictions, for it to be domestic violence, you have to meet various kinds of criteria. The most obvious one is whether you're cohabitants. Do you live together? It doesn't mean you have to be married. Sometimes a dating relationship in certain jurisdictions suffices, but if you live together, you're there. So, and if that living arrangement, even if it didn't occur in the house, that can still be defined as domestic violence.
Okay. And then what kind of acts qualify for domestic violence?
Well, I know a lot of people would like to say that words qualify, but I've never bought into that. Usually has to be some kind of a physical assault, battery, something along those lines at a bare minimum, and have to be in the context, you would hope, of at least when you're being prosecuted, so to speak, of the relationship. You would also, when you're trying to seek a domestic violence restraining order, there are certain elements you have to satisfy, and not the least of which is that it was done in the context of the relationship.
Right. And over the last 10 years, what I've seen in family court is a move towards allowing just sort of general harassment, sending a lot of emails, sending texts, calling someone terrible names repeatedly, starting to qualify as domestic violence. Have you seen the same trend? And
Well, by the way, do you practice family law?
yeah, I practice family law.
Okay. So when my then partner got appointed to the bench many years ago, he was assigned to family law. And I asked the then presiding judge, who was an ex public defender, I said, why family law? And he said, because I know it's the one place you'll never appear. And I
Right.
said, yeah, I get it. And yes, I will. In fact, I invoke my father all the time. He used to say family law is where it's a battle of the perjuries. So yes, at this point, anything goes when you're over in family law court, and you're referee. Basically, you're a referee. And one of the reasons I hate family law is because you can feel like you've hit equilibrium for 15 minutes, and then you're back to square one 23 minutes later.
Right. Right. It's a tough place to litigate for sure. And
And you don't get a jury.
right. Right. Oh, maybe it has some advantages or disadvantages depending on the judge. But lately, the problem has been the judges have been circulating out of family law so quickly that they stay for a year or two. And once they start learning family law and understanding the topic, they're out because people don't want to stay in family law. It used to be judges stayed for a good 10 years and then retired, but it's just not happening these days.
Well, my partner, she's been there for going on 12 years. And it's amazing to me. And she enjoys it. And there are certain personalities that enjoy kind of navigating that. I mean, it's high drama, it's high tension, but I don't want to minimize, there's a great deal of psychic rewards if you're able to navigate all that. It's just all of the kind of the path that you have to take to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Long path. For people who have not been involved in the criminal law process and in any sort of criminal defense, can you describe to them what happens from the minute the police show up? If you're involved in some sort of incident, you're the alleged perpetrator of some sort of crime or domestic violence. What happens step by step? Because most of us have never been anywhere near that. We've sort of seen it on TV, but what's the process like?
Well, one of the, you see a lot of memes or short videos the internet or Instagram with lawyers saying if you get pulled over, you only have shut the fuck up. Oh,
Right.
that's become one of my favorite memes. I always tell clients, you only have memorize these words. I want my lawyer.
Right.
Period. End of story. And you just repeat that like a mantra. Because unfortunately, been there, done that. Most people default to this idea. There is an amazing magnetic pull to the idea that I can talk my way out of something. That is natural human nature. Everybody defaults to that. And inevitably, what happens is they talk themselves into something. It's the complete opposite. It's almost foolproof. There's very few theories in the world that work 90% of the time. Most theories top out at 80%. But I would say one of the exceptions is the idea that you're going to talk yourself out of jeopardy in the criminal context.
Right. And so the police show up, they want to start asking a lot of questions. If you are unfortunate enough to start talking to them, what are they trying to do? Where are they trying to lead you? And what's the next step?
First, one of the first things that they try to do is to get you to confirm your place at a scene and your participation. Because in various jurisdictions, I will give you California, if it's a misdemeanor that's not committed in their presence, absent your statement, they generally, general rule, don't have the ability to take you into custody. Right. So if you and you have to do the mental gymnastics, and then the cops do the same thing. It's a dance. Can they arrest you? For instance, after OJ, and this literally is the truth, in California, LAPD instituted a zero tolerance policy. So no matter what, if there was a domestic violence call, didn't matter if you're a man, woman, or child, you ended up getting arrested, $50,000 bail, and you would be arrested for domestic violence. Now, that you may not be filed on, but that's what you were going to get arrested for. Now, if it was something that was not committed in their presence, the only way they can arrest you at that point is to arrest you as a felon to jump over the prohibition on a misdemeanor. So that's one of the things they're looking for. They're also looking for, as anybody would, they want you to confess, because even though, and it's ironic, because I think there's two corollaries and lessons, so to speak. The Innocence Project has been wildly successful in the last couple of decades. In fact, I would argue that the Innocence Project has been largely responsible for a change in the feeling towards the death penalty. And the reason for that is they've been wildly successful in proving that people who were convicted or wrongly convicted were wrongly convicted in a large percentage of the time on two different bases: faulty eyewitness testimony and a false confession. Because people tend to just gravitate. They think if somebody gets up there and testifies, I saw him do it, or if somebody gets up and testifies, she's already admitted to it or she's confessed to it, game over. That's just the layperson result.
Mm-hmm. Now, jumping ahead, so you have a criminal defendant who unfortunately gets convicted. What can he or she do to mitigate the damage, or they're going through the process and it looks like they're going to be found guilty? Are there things that they can do to mitigate the damage? Are there ways they can change themselves or improve themselves that help their outcome?
Well, first of all, it depends. Are we talking about the lawyer, the client, the prosecutor? Because I think it varies depending on who you're asking. I tried a case years ago where halfway through the trial, it became apparent to me that my client was covering for a relative of his. And I stumbled onto this. Client hadn't told me a thing. And then I got out of nowhere a piece of evidence out of a witness. And I turned to my client and I said, when were you going to tell me that that you were covering for X? And kind of sheepishly looked at me. I didn't want to get him in trouble. I said, you realize you're facing life and you're covering up for this. Now, he ended up in that particular case, interestingly, there were two different incidents involving two different purported accusers. We beat one and he lost on the other, where he had not told me the truth going into it.
Right.
But I did not give up. I kept going and I found some evidence post verdict that I then presented to one of the jurors. I got the juror to do a declaration saying, if I had known then what I now know, I never would have voted guilty. Believe it or not, the trial court judge did not grant a motion for new trial before sentencing. I had to go to the Court of Appeal. And you know what? I've got a published decision, and it's mind-boggling to me, but a published decision that argues, and I give hat tip to Cliff Gardner, who was my appellate counsel. It stands for the proposition that a hung jury is better than a conviction. Now, you and I would say, well, that's obvious.
Right.
It was not obvious to this trial court judge. So we had to go, we had to do it. That's for the lawyer. Never give up.
Right.
For the client, if you know that you're good for something, and only you know whether you're good for something, one of the things that you can do is to frame your case in terms of, this is not something I'm ever going to put myself in a position to do again. I'm never going to make this decision again. I think right now about Tiger Woods, even though if you've watched Tiger Woods' videotapes, I think his case is infinitely beatable. But he made a decision, if you believe the reporting, to fly to Switzerland and seek help. So even though he was a 0.0 in terms of alcohol and refused the urinalysis test, and if you believe the reporting, he's been on and off addicted due to his many injuries and things to painkillers, he's decided to deal with it. That's a great thing. There was another LA Superior Court judge who once commented, and has stuck with me ever since, that back in the 80s, he used to say cocaine was the parking ticket of the LA Superior Court. If you go and sit in most criminal courtrooms, you will see that addiction informs or is related or is tangential to 80 to 90% of the criminal law.
Right. And in family law, oftentimes I'll recommend to my clients, you've got to get into therapy. You've got to get into a 52-week abuser course. You've got to do all these things to show the judge sort of a mea culpa. I realized what I did was wrong, and the way you framed it, it's never going to happen again. This was very situation specific. Does that fly in criminal law? Trying to get there?
It does. I think that most people want, but especially in the U.S., we're conditioned to like redemption story.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing this podcast?
Oh, for about 4 years now.
And what do you like most about it?
I like meeting interesting people like you, first of all. Years ago, I was interviewing psychologists and accountants and sort of digging into family law. And then I got into a run of talking to celebrities about their own divorces and how they got through it, how it affected them, how they recreated their lives afterwards. For a while, I got into comedians addressing the same issue. And then this season, we've gotten deeper into domestic violence and parental alienation. So I've talked to some victims. I've talked to a prosecutor. Now you're the defense side. And it allows me, I was a psychologist before I was a family law attorney. That's 30 years in the past. But it allows me to sort of mix psychology and law, show where the two of them intersect, and bring that to the general public.
It's funny. The combination of psychology and the law is a very unique skill set. In fact, I have once again, invoking my father, one of his law school classmates who was one of the most highly successful Hollywood entertainment lawyers, legendary. he about 15, I think, years into his career, decided to go and get his psychology degree
Yeah.
and get trained as a therapist because he thought it was so important to
Yeah.
his which, by the way, is why I never wanted to be an entertainment lawyer, because I always thought I like action in the courtroom. I don't want to be your therapist.
Right, right. That's a big part of my job, is whether you call it therapy or social work or trying to rearrange their lives. I'm trying to get them through these divorces and then figure out what they want to do on the other side.
So do you find that it's enormously challenging emotionally for you? And do you find it hard to set boundaries?
Yeah, you know what? I learned as a psychologist. I worked on the East Coast. I worked in I lived in Upper Manhattan and worked in the Bronx. And I had like a 45-minute train ride when I was a therapist. And I sort of trained myself way back then that I would get off the subway at my stop and I would have left the people behind, whatever they were going through, and complaining about all their problems. And sometimes I was successful and sometimes I wasn't. And then I was a family law in Philadelphia, moved out here to California, and I keep the same promise. The drive home from the courthouse, I open up the roof of the car, turn up the music real loud, and just try and let everything from court blow out and right out the sunroof. And I also don't take any of this stuff home. If I have to work on a weekend, I go to the office. I don't like bringing my clients' problems into my home. And so I'm someone who builds very strong boundaries between work and home. A lot of my colleagues don't. And I don't know how they do it.
And what do you find, when people ask me, I get this quite a bit, and I don't know if it's my age, how long I've been doing it, but I get quite a bit of questions, referrals for family law. And once again, I invoke my father: divorce never, murder maybe.
Right.
And I have counseled, I can't tell you how many people, especially if you've got just kids. I don't understand. I don't understand divorce if you've got just kids. And I mean it in this sense, and maybe you can answer this question for me. I've had numerous friends where I say, why are you divvying up everything? Why are you fighting over this car or this thing or this piece of property? Aren't all of your things going to go to your kids, or to, if you're fortunate enough to have a large enough estate, to a charity or something? So what is the point of divvying it up and fighting over this? Because the cynic in me says the only one who wins in those cases are the lawyers.
Absolutely. And, it's for me, it's a difference, East Coast versus West Coast. I practiced 6 years on the East Coast, 23 here. On the East Coast, people didn't have the money or the professional egos to engage in these fights. They go to court, see that no one wins, and quickly settled. 80% of my cases settled, 20% ultimately went to trial. I moved out here to Los Angeles, and the money people have is astounding sometimes, and their egos are even more astounding, and they want to win. They want to win on principles, and it doesn't matter how many times I tell them, no one's going to win here.
Nobody wins. It's a fool's errand. You just don't win. And when you win, it's the most Pyrrhic victory you could ever imagine, because who's lying on the battlefield? All your close loved ones, or at least theoretically.
Right. I mean, it keeps me in business, but it's absolutely tragic. It's the same question when people come to me. I always ask, what was going on in the marriage? A lot of family law attorneys don't. They sort of jump into what are the assets? How much money do you make? That sort of stuff. And I always recommend, do you want to try counseling? Do you want to try marriage counseling? Give it a shot. And very few people want to even give it a shot. And maybe it's because it's the time period they've come to me. I just find that people don't have, they don't want to be persistent. They don't want to try to figure things out. If they run into trouble, they want out. And I find that tragic.
It's break glass always first, and it's always an emergency first. Break glass as opposed to a literal slow burn. Yeah, it's interesting. There's the old adages about criminal law are bad people on their best behavior and family law are good people on their worst behavior. I don't even know that it's that, because my feeling about the criminal law, at least, and in spite of my reputation, I guess I only do probably at this point 20% of my practice is criminal. The rest is very similar to family law. Our business disputes gone awry, which can be as emotionally charged. But it's amazing to me how economic cost benefit goes out the window, and it just becomes to take a page out of what you just said. It's I must win it all
Right.
without any idea as to what I'm leaving in my wake.
Right. And it's another way to look at it is, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? I used to say that to my patients who were having marital problems back when I was a psychologist. Do you want to be right and win that argument, or do you want to be happy? I would choose happy every time. And sometimes there's an easy way out that you can be happy and not necessarily be right. And that wrong quickly goes into the past.
So what's your practice though?
So it's fully family law. I do premarital agreements. That's only about 10% of the work. It's high net worth litigation. I have a team of 7 associates with me here, and we take the biggest cases where people want to argue about custody, want to argue about complex property division, or want to argue about high earner support. And we take them through that with all the divorce and all the story concocting and making sure that their story will possibly sell well to the judge and all that preparation. It's a lot of work to get there and a lot of money.
So one of my dear friends, he's now passed away, was a legend in the family law arena. You remember Steve Kolodny?
Yeah, he was the first guy I worked with when I moved out here to Los Angeles. I got a job at his White Shoe family law firm, and I learned more from him in 2 years than I had in the prior 7 years practicing.
Yeah, Steve Kolodny was amazing. A couple of times he used to teach a seminar in Texas, as I remember. And I met Bo Nichols when I was there, who's a lawyer in Texas, who I've kept in contact with just briefly over the years. But Kolodny, we used to do a cross-examination seminar there. And Steve was in the family law arena, what a legend he was. Yeah. But he generally, and now he's got a lot of acolytes, yourself included. I mean, I could go, there's Marina, there's Ani, there's all kinds of people who kind of drafted behind him. But it's an amazing thing if you have lawyers that watch you, just watching different lawyers in different arenas practice their craft. So Steve, who probably practiced for 50 years, never argued a case in front of a jury. And his approach when we would teach cross-examination to what he was trying to elicit from a witness, the same witness, because I'm looking towards my closing argument in front of a jury and who I've picked as a jury, who my audience is, as opposed to you guys who have one kind of audience member. I'm looking at a dynamic and not just 12. I'm looking at who's my general, who's the lieutenant, who's kind of falling into a line. It's really a fascinating thing to watch the different skill sets and the different techniques that people use in terms of, for instance, cross-examination.
Yeah, and the most important thing I learned from him was too many family law attorneys are punch and counterpunch. I'm going to do this and you're going to do that and I'm going to do this. And he was playing chess. He was 5 or 6 moves ahead of everyone with where he was going. So he taught me in that short amount of time how to think ahead.
True. That's so true. I always used to say about Steve when I talked to him, and we talked with great frequency. In fact, during the Pelicano era, he was actually a client of mine when all of that blew up. You'll remember it shook the LA legal establishment to its core. For those who don't remember, talk about the intersection of family law and criminal law.
Right.
There was all kinds of supposed wiretapping that was going on in a very contentious family law case, and it ended up getting the U.S. attorney, the FBI going on. I used to laugh in the civil arena. There was a flurry of lawsuits, all revolving around everybody who was suing everybody in regards to the wiretapping. And we used to sit back in the old Central Civil Courthouse over by Liners, and they would in the giant courtroom, and I'll never forget Judge Peter Lichman sitting over there. And I would just be yelling at him, "You've got to set a trial date. You've got to set a trial date." And he'd be pushing back. "If I set a trial date, I'm going to get 40 MSJs. I don't have enough clerks here to read and digest the 40 MSJs." And so it was quite a time to be litigating in LA. And Steve was right smack dab in the middle of that, along with Laura Wasser's dad, Dennis, and Eddie Glazer was in that. Brian's son was there. But it was like a cavalcade of the Hall of Fame of LA lawyers.
That was my first year with Steve. I was working on that case, and he didn't want me using the phones in the office. He gave us all burner cell phones to use, and I thought he was paranoid. I thought he was
exactly.
Years later, it came up, and I was like, I don't believe it. He was 100% on the mark.
He was not only on the mark. There were banks apparently and the phone company was involved. I mean, it was just quite a story. I forget the name. Oh, Anita Bush had written about it and was for momentarily, I think, a client of my brother's and myself as well. But it was just a story. What a story to be told.
Yeah. Anyway, to wrap up here. What happens if someone is convicted of domestic violence? How does that affect their life, their career, their relationships? How long does this sort of thing hang with you?
Well, I will tell you, before the current kind of thinking on gun rights, for instance, domestic violence conviction in California, you used to forfeit in the old days your right to bear arms. I mean, you had a Second Amendment right. I remember fighting that battle before anybody had ever talked to me, knew Heller from Schmeller. I mean, I'd say, I don't understand. How do I plead to a client to a misdemeanor and I'm forfeiting one of his main constitutional rights, the Second Amendment, last time I looked in. And so it can have wide-ranging consequences. I will tell you, in addition to that especially where you and I practice, it can be the death knell for a job. It can be the death knell for a security clearance. If you get convicted of domestic violence and you have a license, doctor, lawyer, anything in California, that can impact your license. So there are collateral consequences, immigration consequences. I mean, you name it, it ticks off virtually every box in terms of what can happen to you.
Yeah. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and especially the part where we went off topic and just talking about the practice of law in LA. I can't thank you enough for coming on today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and sorry for going off topic, but if you knew me, you'd know I'm constantly off topic. So I appreciate and thank you.
That's when the interesting stuff comes up. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Mark, for joining us today. I have no doubt that what you've shared will help a good many of our viewers who might not be handling their breakup very well. Now, there are a number of books out there about the do's and don'ts of breaking up. I happen to have written one called Moving On: How to Redesign Your Emotional, Financial, and Social Life After Divorce. There are also a number of help centers you can reach out to. As always, thanks for tuning in.